Hi, I'm Suraya, and I will be talking about spatial software. Thank you for the great intro, and thank you all for watching and listening. I'm hyped to be here. I'm obsessed with Figma and all the amazing 3D things that we can make with it. Just to quickly intro myself, I'm a designer and an engineer, and I grew up spending an embarrassingly amount of time in digital worlds like Neopets, Webkins, Club Penguin, etc. I was always really drawn to these products that inspire people to kind of create their own identity, their own world, and I became really interested in figuring out ways to construct narratives and worlds that make people want to spend all their time there and really emotionally invested. So right now, I am the co-founder of HAGS, which is a universe for high school students to interact with classmates, play games, unlock digital rewards. And I thought for this talk, I could focus on really practical ways of designing spatial products using Figma. But I'll start by just discussing what spatial software is, and most importantly, why it's so full of potential, can make people feel really good, and why I think it's magical. So what is spatial software, 3D software? You may think of products like Sims, which is really social and mobile focused, or Roblox, which is really popular with younger audiences right now, focused on gaming and also social. IMVU, which is really popular, very avatar, fashion-driven. Elden Ring, very narrative-driven and kind of like story and explorative. And my recent favorite is Complex Land, which is a web-based experience, and it's basically a spatial festival focused on fashion and luxury music drops. So these are all examples of spatial products that exist today, but we still haven't really made the case for why they're necessary. You know, like, do they make people feel good? Is there just too much saturation right now and noise with building virtual worlds? Why should we actually build spatial software? That still feels a little unanswered. And for me, the best way to think about why we should build spatial software is to take a little bit step back and kind of understand why we're drawn to spatial elements in the first place. So what is spatial? Well, the most obvious answer is, of course, real life. You know, the people you interact with, the things you do, the world you've built for yourself. It's all real, it's all familiar, and it's obviously 3D. And because you're able to experience this 3D life you live, you're also able to really easily relate to it when you see it in a different view, like in movies or in TV shows. And so Spatial, for example, is the world of Harry Potter that has left generations of people of all ages feeling really inspired, really connected. Part of that success is just creating a really captivating story within this fictional world that viewers want to be a part of and want to spend time in. There's also Avatar, which leaves people feeling really grand, really courageous. Or Mean Girls, which is a classic story that isn't science fiction at all, but represents the relatability of high school in a way that is timeless and still resonates with us today. And so something that all of these movies have in common is that they all evoke a really specific feeling, whether that's feeling inspired or courageous or just related to. Strong narratives leave lasting impressions. And so spatial concepts, whether a movie or whether a product, can really immerse people into a world and help them feel strong emotions. And so at the company that we're working on now, at HAGS, we believe that products should just be more aspirational than they are now and should evoke emotion kind of like the worlds in our favorite movies or stories do. And there's no reason that products shouldn't feel as timeless or as epic as our favorite movies and TV shows. So luckily, spatial products have a lot of potential, and it's pretty exciting to think beyond what exists today. And if we think of them similar to constructing a movie or a TV show, as opposed to building an app or a website, I think it helps unlock this world of possibility for building spatial software that doesn't feel dystopian, but is kind of a natural extension of the human experience. Okay, So spatial design clearly has a lot of potential. I hope we all feel bought in, optimistic. Let's get into how we can actually make spatial software products using Figma as our source of truth. So where do we start? A good place to start for our team, and to constantly revisit as well, is thinking about the fundamental constraints of a 3D product. And I'll explain a little bit about what I mean. So for a 2D app, or website, or whatever your platform is that you're building for, as designers, you think of things like hierarchy or user flow, information architecture, etc., in order to lay out information in a way that achieves whatever your product's goal is. When you add in the third dimension, you need to think really deeply about identity and movement as the foundational elements that will shape how your product feels when someone uses it. So identity and movement shapes how users feel. We already established that spatial concepts are amazing for making people feel something, and we could really spend hours or years or whatever talking about identity, since it's this massive topic. And if you'd like to do that, DM me on Twitter or something. I love talking about it. But for the sake of this talk, I think what's most important to highlight here is that a really good place to start is just by defining how do you want your users to feel. And once you kind of come up with that word or phrase or whatever it is, it's a lot easier to make decisions and have a direction. And so for the Hags app, which I'll kind of use as an example throughout this presentation, the goal for Hags was always to be a place of comfort for high school students and also be fun and socially chaotic. So once we kind of defined that as the goal, it was a guiding principle throughout our design process. And since spatial products can really immerse people into a world and help them feel like they belong, it made sense for Hags to also be 3D. So I'll talk a little bit about the identity system that we use at Hags. For us, our goal is to help high school students feel this sense of comfort, like I mentioned, and then we went ahead and realized that we should add a spatial layer to their real-life high school experience. So really, that allowed us to realize that, okay, it's important that avatars in Hags look attractive and familiar, since that kind of matches our goal of who we're targeting. And so for us, Bitmoji was the perfect fit, and so it's been really, really fun for our team to imagine all of our ideas within the world of Bitmoji and kind of work within those constraints of the product as well. So now that we know the fundamental threads of spatial design, I thought we could go over 5 really, really practical ways of designing a spatial product in Figma. And I'll continue to use Hags as an example so that we can kind of see an app that's actually used these methods. So I'm going to start by talking about something that our team thinks is probably the most important aspect of anything 3D, which is prototyping early. So we just talked about how identity and movement influences how someone will feel using the product, and it's really important to prototype from day one so that you constantly have a pulse on whether what you're exploring is in line with how you want the user to feel. And Figma is great for this because it can kind of serve as the source of truth for your whole team, whether engineering or 3D or whatever your focus is, as you kind of work to build out your world. So this is a mood board that we use for Hags, and it kind of represents the brand feel of what I mentioned earlier, which is wanting students to feel really comfortable, but also keeping things fun and socially chaotic. And mood boarding and branding is so important for a spatial product where the design is really the differentiator between whether the interface ends up feeling really dystopian and awful or really inspiring and epic. So when you're prototyping early, you may not even have defined features or really know what you're doing. So having a strong sense of your brand will really enable you to kind of explore within constraints of what you're trying to evoke emotion for. And so an easy way to start prototyping is literally to just grab thousands of screenshots of existing references and throw them on a Figma file. Get a feel for how different avatars feel in different environments, layouts, orientations. Get a feel for how camera angles make a difference, because when you're designing for 3D, really the camera becomes your best friend. So you want to end up with thousands of different references of angles and screenshots and try to kind of narrow in on, am I achieving the feeling that we wanted at the beginning? So it doesn't really matter what screenshot looks like, but doing really, really high volume, quick examples will really develop your taste and narrow down your direction. Big shout out to Figma's infrastructure team. I'm sure we've pushed the limits on our Figma file sizes with the amount of images that we use. This was actually another really early iteration of Hags, which was obviously more abstract, also made in Figma with like really basic shapes and colors. And we realized that since we're building this spatial layer on top of a real high school student's life, it didn't really make sense for us to be abstract. But in other products, maybe you're building something that is in fiction or more escapist, and so this sort of abstract design sense might be really fun and make a lot of sense. So I'll start by talking about just prototyping movement. A really, really easy way to prototype movement on day one is just to use Smart Animate in Figma. That's something we did pretty much right when we decided to use Bitmoji. And this is also how we actually settled on using 2D avatars and 2D representations of Bitmoji inside a 3D world environment, kind of ending up with this 2.5D retro sort of look for the entire product, which made sense for us because we're targeting gamers as opposed to, we're targeting high school students as opposed to gamers, so we wanted something to feel really, really friendly. And so I think it's important to remember, you don't need to wait for 3D models or assets or, entire 3D environments to be built out. You can kind of just throw things in as you figure them out, smart animate them, and be really, really hacky about it. Once we settled on the 2.5D look, our team started to prototype different chatting and movement, and we actually realized really, really quickly, this example actually, that the bird's eye view and the tap to move interactions really didn't feel socially chaotic at all, and they probably wouldn't scale with a bunch of students at once. And that's something really important to remember when designing a spatial product, is that you have to scale it with literal physical avatars you're going to see in the environment. And a lot of times the designs may actually look really good in Figma and feel okay, but the minute there's movement involved in a prototyping environment, things will feel off. So creating some sort of cycle between high volume Figma screenshots, high volume mocks into a software environment makes this really, really easy. So after that prototype, we very quickly realized, okay, we need to get a bunch more avatars in and see how things feel. And in that screenshot phase I mentioned earlier, we kind of narrowed in on this hallway metaphor as something that felt really good to us in terms of it's fun, it's socially chaotic, it's really familiar for high school students. And so we started to prototype with mainly hallway environments. And so with this one, we kind of felt like things weren't feeling as immersive as we wanted. I guess now immersive is just this annoying buzzword, but in this context for this prototype, it really just didn't feel compelling enough for users to want to spend a lot of time in. And we didn't feel like we were making them bought in that this was an environment that could be layered on top of their school experience. So eventually, through a lot of rounds of this kind of back and forth between quick Figma screenshots, mood boarding, explorative prototypes, we got to this prototype, which is first-person point of view, users skateboarding through the product in this 3D hallway, and this is what the Hags app looks like today in the school environment. And we felt like we kind of achieved that initial goal of students feeling comfortable and familiar, but also it being kind of socially chaotic. Cool. Okay, the next kind of aspect of spatial design that I think is really important and has been really important for our team is faking perspective and learning how to fake perspective as a designer or really for anyone on your team. So the most obvious difference with anything spatial is that there's no z-axis in 2D software like Figma, and so you kind of have to figure out how to fake perspective very quickly. And you can do this in a really, really simple way using abstract shapes and symmetry. So I'll use an example from Hags actually. Something we were trying to work on earlier this year was helping students figure out how to visit nearby schools. The idea was like, how can we help students meet people with similar interests? how many schools do we show? They should be able to see people who are nearby, who use kind of the same things that they do. And so instead of trying to design this all at once, something we did really early to simply represent perspective was just use abstract shapes in Figma. So we do this a lot where if we just want to kind of explain how much space a certain feature or user flow will have, you can just use abstract circles or whatever it is to kind of demonstrate the different levels of perspective in an environment. And this is really helpful because it also gives engineers the opportunity to give really early input on the movement and spatial constraints that more often than not come up anyway in the engineering and prototyping process. So this is super helpful for getting something down really quick and getting the whole team on board. And another simple way to mock perspective, which is something we also use a lot, is using symmetry. And so if you make really simple shapes like this floor or this wall that you can kind of see on the left, where you can kind of see that they're basic rectangles, a little bit warped, and then you essentially just duplicate them and flip them horizontally or vertically, you can start to create these really basic 3D spaces and shapes that get the job done in terms of demonstrating space. Because I think the main goal with spatial design isn't really to get to something pixel perfect, because you'll never be able to kind of capture all of the camera angles, but it's to get something that really communicates all of the feel and the different space involved as early as possible. So a quick topic I thought that we could talk about, which would be fun, is what about actually establishing the world visually? We've talked about how to kind of start fast and hit the ground running when you don't have the 3D assets, but then eventually that 3D world also comes together alongside the brand. And so thinking about what goes into the environment, how do these objects interact with UI elements, and how each object actually contributes to the product's overall narrative. So this is a snapshot of the Hags world. You can probably see at a high level even just how that early stage of mood boarding and screenshot explorations in Figma contributed to the look and feel of the environment. And pretty much every step of the way we go back to, okay, well, does this achieve the goal of making people feel comfortable? And then an important way to think is, as you start to define your features and kind of work out the 2D mechanics of your product, layering can really help open just different avenues of thinking. So naturally, the UI operates differently when you're trying to fit this whole world into a standard device screen. So thinking in terms of layering 2D and 3D elements can really ensure that you're never working against the 3D and the 2D. They're integrated and achieving the same goal. So the fourth practical tip I'd like to talk about is really fun, and it's about personalization and design systems. Something that's good to constantly think about is the affordances of spatial design. So what does spatial design give us that 2D design doesn't? And a big one is meaningful personalization and meaningful levels of personalization. So personalization is really one of the main elements of 3D software that help people feel so emotionally invested and so immersed into a product. And a really good way we've found at Hags to design for personalization is by baking it into your design system. One way to think about this at a really simple level is to think about 3D assets and think about how can we strip them back to their most basic form so that they're really reusable and easy to personalize. Very similar to the 2D UI elements that you may already be used to designing and you may already put into your design system. And that way, we can kind of start to figure out how to integrate the 2D and 3D elements into a singular system. So I'll show you guys an example of how we do this at Hags. Here's a few 2D components of our design system at Hags. It's a few navigation bars on the left, some reusable invite modals in the middle, and you can kind of use them in different environments. There's some footers on the right. They're basically just different 2D UI elements. And it's actually a really fun process to think about the components you're designing in terms of, well, what 3D environments will they eventually live in, and how will that integrate with the user experience? And so you can kind of see here, some of the more stripped down 3D assets coming together, and they focus on basic personalization. So for HAGs, we care about school logos, school colors, graduation years, all the elements of a high school experience that can be personalized with data. And so in these Figma mocks, we're able to really easily add in personalization by treating the 3D assets as components. So this leads to defining the building blocks of the 3D environment. It's overwhelming to think of a virtual world sometimes. There's a billion objects that could go into it. It's a lot simpler to break it down in terms of building blocks that are important for your user to feel whatever you want them to feel. And so for HAGs, kind of like I mentioned, that's school banners, lockers, and buildings. And the way we personalize them is really simple. We use color overlays and text styles in Figma with screenshots of these assets in order to make them feel personal for different schools, different geographies, different people. And then on the 3D side, if you're in Blender or a different sort of 3D software, it becomes a lot easier to actually design and do the 3D modeling, whether it's yourself, whether it's 3D designer, 3D artist. When you strip them down into these like building blocks, it's a lot easier and faster for anyone to approach the 3D side of building this product. And using Figma as your source of truth for conceptualizing this structure, it makes it a lot easier to develop a hybrid design, engineering, 3D workflow to build whatever you're trying to build. These are some final mocks from the HAGs app. You can kind of see what they end up looking like, and you also probably see that they were really constructed with the building blocks that I mentioned. So on the left, you have like a locker. In the middle, it's the banners and the posters, and on the right, you have the school buildings. And so we really think of both the 3D and the 2D elements as different types of building blocks for the same product. The last area I would like to talk about is creative ways to collaborate with engineering. These are some tips we've picked up along the way of building HAGs that I think have been really, really helpful for our team. And so as a refresher, this is what we used kind of earlier to explain how to simply abstract perspective. And this is what the designs end up looking like. However, we didn't start with kind of like the whole world up front. And kind of like I mentioned earlier, working with engineering, this makes things a lot easier because engineers can kind of start to prototype the movement and the actual world much faster. Another example I thought I would call out is how to mock animations in a way that is really helpful for designers and engineers to work together. And so one Blender workflow that we found really helpful for us is basically creating actual animations in Blender and exporting them as PNG frames. And that way, you basically have endless assets to use in your actual app when you're creating designs. So you don't have to worry about optimization or about like different sorts of assets in your actual software engineering environment. If you try to create animations in your Blender file and export them, you can use them as kind of storyboarded mocks. So you kind of end up with something like this. This is an animation we do where you click on buttons and then you kind of zoom out and into the HAGs world. And we use this as a storyboarded animation directly from Blender. And then the last example is the HAGs navigation system, something that we didn't intend to do but ended up doing a lot in the process of building our product is we actually create in-app tutorials to explain to engineering how to use complex interactions. And that's something that we found makes things really, really simple for engineers. Thank you for listening. I hope that everyone feels inspired to make spatial design. We definitely need more product designers in it, and thank you.